Good afternoon, and welcome to the launch of a new discussion paper titled Universal Basic Income, UBI, and a Wellbeing Economy. This is a proposal for Ireland and is brought to you by Feasta and the Environmental Pillar in collaboration with Equal Right. I'm Anne-Marie Fuller. I'm chairperson of the Board of Trustees of Feasta, the Foundation for the Economics of Sustainability. Feasta is an ecological economics think tank with a 25-year track record of research, advocacy, and public education. Our mission is to articulate and promote the changes needed to make the necessary transition to a safe and just space for humanity within a resilient, healthy global ecosystem. Our work spans ecological fiscal reform, monetary systems, food security, climate justice, and basic income, to mention some. Feasta holds the Secretariat of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, Ireland Hub, that's the We All Ireland Hub, and is the lead organiser of Galore, the 12th International Degrowth Conference and Festival, which is going to take place in Cork City in August 2027. So you might want to pop that into your diaries. So Feasta are also a member of the Environmental Pillar, and the Environmental Pillar is the advocacy arm of the Irish Environmental Network, that's the IEN, most people are familiar with. And this is where national environmental non-governmental organisations, NGOs, come together to collectively develop and advance policy solutions in environmental protection, a sustainable economy, and a just society. One of the Environmental Pillar's policy advocacy groups is the Circular and Wellbeing Economy Hub. And its advocacy positions include support for the universal basic income and other sufficiency-based economic measures as tools for building social resilience and easing pressure on the environment. Today's paper launch, Universal Basic Income and Wellbeing Economy, a proposal for Ireland, is part of the work of this hub and is supported with funding from the Irish Government's Department of Climate, Energy and the Environment. Shortly, I'm going to pass you over to Caroline Whyte from Feasta, an ecological economist, who's going to give us a brief overview of the background and context for the paper. Then, Dr. Patrick Brown from Equal Right is going to present the paper. And finally, it is our pleasure to have Dr. Sarath Davala with us. He's the president of Basic Income Earth Network, BN, who is going to give us his reflections on the paper. And following that, we're going to have our question and answer session, which will be moderated by Caroline and Patrick. And everyone then is going to have an opportunity to exchange your thoughts on the paper, such as thoughts that you might have would be, could Ireland be a trailblazer in introducing a national level UBI? Or what complementary measures and guardrails would be needed to make UBI a success in Ireland and elsewhere in social and ecological terms? And with that, I'm now going to pass you over to Caroline Whyte. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Anne-Marie. That was great. Hello, everyone. Delighted to see you all. We're delighted to be launching this paper today. It was launched. It's supported by the Environmental Pillar. It's one of the Irish social partner groups. There are actually 5 of them in Ireland. There's a fair few people from outside Ireland, so I'll briefly explain. There's the Employers Pillar, the Trade Union Pillar, Farmers Pillar, Community and Voluntary Pillar, and the Environmental Pillar. And I'm very happy to see we have attendees from some other pillars here too, and you're very welcome today. Thank you for coming. So essentially, this paper is being produced by Feasta on behalf of the Circular and Wellbeing Economy Advocacy Hub of the Pillar. And as Anne-Marie mentioned, one of the policies that we're advocating is the idea of sufficiency-based measures, which would ensure everyone's able to lead a decent, dignified life within planetary boundaries. And a big part of why we're so interested in that is sufficiency-based. In case anyone isn't familiar with that term, it means it's a state. Sufficiency is a state in which people's basic needs are being met equitably and ecological limits are being respected as well. So it's kind of a state of balance, if you like, and it really maps onto the idea of the economic donut, which a lot of you will have heard of, which is basically the idea that we need to find a way to live within, if you visualize a donut, without breaching the boundaries, which are the outer circle of a donut, and also without falling into the middle of the donut, the hole. If you fall into the hole, that means that your social needs aren't being met, and social needs are very, very varied. There's lots of different kinds of social needs. The person who came up with the economic donut, Kate Raworth, used the sustainable development goals as the basis for social needs. So even though we're focusing on universal basic income today, a really important point we want to reiterate, and Patrick will talk about this in a minute, is that there's many social needs. Not all of them are financially expressed or ought to be expressed in money. And there are also things like community needs, healthcare, education, housing, really important things. But financial needs are part of the social needs as well. So a big question is, how can we meet those needs without breaching planetary boundaries? And at the moment, and the big focus for us in FASTA is the fact that the evidence from environmental scientists is really clear that we need a big way to achieve that balance and to be able to live within planetary boundaries is to think differently about what are our economic goals, what are our economic objectives, because at the moment there's a huge focus still on the idea of gross domestic product growth, GDP growth, as the kind of major goal for the economy. And but in fact, there's a very, very tight relationship between GDP growth, as in growth of material consumption and production, and ecological damage. And so there's a real need to think differently about what is progress economically. We can go into more detail about that later if we want during the questions. But also in terms of social needs, what do people actually need to live a good life? Is, what's the idea of, again, finding this balance or this kind of Goldilocks, situation where you need a certain amount of food, for example, to live, to, be healthy and thrive, but you don't need too much food. I mean, if you have too much food, that's actually not good for you. And a lot of things are like that. There's a kind of a need for a balance. So there's ways, a big focus for us in FASTA is the need to define and measure progress differently and find ways to ensure our welfare systems can operate well in circumstances where there may not be GDP growth, or there may even be GDP contraction, where there might be less production and consumption, and yet find ways that we can make sure the welfare system works well and everybody can have their needs met. So it's a very interesting challenge. You can think of it a bit like a thermostat as well. We don't want things to overheat. We want there to be a balance, but we also don't want it to be so cold that we're not comfortable. So you need to have that balance. So when I talked about needs, I mentioned financial stability. And so that brings us to universal basic income. And Patrick's going to talk a little bit about exactly what a universal basic income is and what it isn't. So I'm not going to go into that now, but essentially the idea behind universal basic income is to ensure that everyone has that certain minimum level of financial security. And in recent years, there's been, I would say, increased interest in UBI as something that could be done. And I think the COVID crisis sort of brought it to the fore in some ways. And I think it's important to not forget the COVID crisis. It's 6 years ago now that started. And I feel like memories are maybe fading a bit in some ways, but I think it's really important to remember to learn lessons from what happened during COVID. I mean, Ireland arguably didn't do too badly. I think they did do some good things during COVID in response to what was happening. But I think most of us would probably agree that there were also some problems. And one of the problems, as in many places around the world, was that the pandemic really exacerbated the already uneven nature of welfare benefits. So those who couldn't work but didn't qualify for COVID relief, could be thrown into precarity quickly, or conversely, they might feel obliged to go to work even if they had symptoms of COVID, which was actually not only bad for them, but also bad for society, was collectively very bad. It was because, spreading a contagious disease is not a good thing. So I think, you can easily argue that it's a false economy if you don't ensure that everyone has sufficient financial resources. And this is really obvious when there's a pandemic or there's a crisis or turbulence, but it's actually there all the time, really. It's actually something that's, a constant really in society. So as soon as we start talking about UBI, there tends to be really interesting philosophical, questions that pop up. Things like, what makes people want to contribute to society? What makes people want to make a difference in the world? And what are the best ways to make sure that paid work is dignified and meaningful? That's another big question. Another one, which I really find interesting, is the whole narrative about competitiveness. And, to what extent should we be sort of leaning into this, idea that competitiveness should be our big goal? And we hear about it a lot on the geopolitical level, but should we be taking a more nuanced stand on it, from a very sort of grassroots ground level? I mean, personally speaking, working for an NGO, we're expected to apply for funding a lot, and I understand why. And it's a very competitive process, lots of different funding bodies, loads of people applying, loads of groups applying. I think we're not the only ones. Well, as NGOs, I think academics are in a similar position, for example. There's lots of groups in society who are expected to do this. And I find it very questionable whether all that time and energy put into all these applications, which won't all be successful, is actually a very efficient use of time and energy. And I'm not only speaking for us, but I'm speaking for competitor groups who may lose a bid to us, say. I don't think it's actually a win. That's a win-lose situation, and it's actually not great. It's very zero sum. So I think we need to be talking much more about unhealthy competition and not just assuming that all competition is inherently good or desirable. And this is something that comes up a lot these days. And it's the kind of thing that needs to be discussed much more and in much more depth. And so hopefully this paper will contribute to that kind of discussion. And then just in terms of timeliness of the paper, also, we've had the recent Basic Income for Artists in Ireland pilot, which got loads of publicity and lots of attention from around the world, which is very interesting. And I would say largely very positive attention. And so we've been drawing on that, and Patrick has been working from that, some of the findings for that in the paper, as you'll see. And also another thing I wanted to mention is that we're involved in the project FASTA with two other pillar members, Talamh Beo and Cultivate. And Talamh Beo is the Irish branch of Via Campesina, which is a massive, massive agroecology network all around the world. So basically, we're working on looking at how structured income supports, a kind of a basic income in a way, for local food producers could help build security, food security in Ireland. So this is very relevant and timely to what's going on geopolitically. We're also looking at how it could interact with a UBI, a universal basic income. So that's some research down the line, but for quite soon, in the next couple of months, we'll be publishing that. So hopefully I've just touched a few things that will spark a bit of discussion for later. I'm going to pass on to Patrick in a minute. I'm delighted to pass to Patrick. He's the director of Equal Right, and he's also a member of FASTA. And Equal Right is a global nonprofit working to advance universal basic income and climate justice. And Patrick himself is actually based in Northern Ireland. He's a County Down person like myself, roots in County Down. He's a former councillor, and he's also a former member of the Legislative Assembly, which, for those not in Ireland or the UK, just to explain, that's the equivalent of being an MP or a deputy for the Northern Ireland government. And Patrick also has a PhD from Queen's University in Belfast. His PhD actually focused on basic income in Northern Ireland. So he's very well placed to be researching these things. And it's been an absolute pleasure to work with you, Patrick, and I'm very pleased to pass over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Caroline. I wouldn't quite put MLAs on the same tier as MPs and deputies, to be fair, but still, of course, a privilege to have played that role. But I now inhabit the role as executive director at Equal Right, which gives me the opportunity to spend most of my time researching and advocating for basic income in Ireland, across the UK, and indeed all across the world, which is kind of the dream, right, for someone like me who's kind of obsessed with this topic. Caroline, do you have the slides there? Okay, are you able to share them? Feel free to bring those up whenever. And great. I'll explain why we framed this paper in particular around the idea of a well-being economy, and also what we think is genuinely kind of new, and the contribution of this paper. And then I'm also going to talk a bit about the environmental and the well-being economy case for basic income, because I think that's really where the key contribution of this paper lies. I'm also going to touch a bit on how we think basic income, or UBI, as I'll probably use interchangeably throughout this presentation, could work in practice in Ireland, how it could be paid for, and I will finish up with some of the recommendations that you can find at the end of the paper. I'm going to talk a bit about financing and how we pay for it. That'll be fairly brief. All of the detail is in the paper, and it is a substantial enough paper at just over 50 pages, fully designed. So please do check it out on the due to be published very soon on this call. Okay, so everything within the paper sits inside one idea or core concept, and that is how a UBI can help us advance a well-being economy. We've defined a well-being economy as simply an economy that is designed intentionally and from the outset to deliver good lives for people within planetary limits. And that's quite a substantial challenge and very different to how we currently do things, where the goal is generally to grow GDP, and we more or less hope that well-being and a healthy environment trickles down from there if it even does so at all. So why does a well-being economy matter for those of us interested in working on basic income? Um, Often, if you look at basic income on its own in isolation, it's sometimes easy to pass it over as just another welfare reform or as a response to poverty or increased automation in the economy. It's a very popular one at the minute with everything that's going on with AI. But the moment you place it inside the framing of a well-being economy, I certainly feel, and hopefully others do as well, it's really trying to achieve something quite different. And I think the real aim is to try and take some of the pressure off people who would otherwise be pushed into ecologically damaging work or consumption, to build resilience, to allow households and communities to better absorb climate shocks. So really much more broad than our current conception of basic income. The case that we're making here is really that UBI can and should be one of the foundations of a well-being economy, and very much the income floor that other policies build on. Okay, so that's slide two there. So talking about the broader conception of basic income, how it can both provide income security, influence ecological behavior, which is something I'll talk about a bit more further on, and also build social and climate resilience. Third slide there, Caroline. So before I go any further, let's discuss what we mean by basic income. And I'll explain shortly why I have the universal part in brackets there. So we take our definition from BN, the Basic Income Earth Network, which is the main organization advancing basic income education globally. I'm delighted to be joined today by the chair of BN, Sarath. And Sarath, you'll be very happy to know that I'm using the BN definition, of course. And BN lists five key features for what a basic income is. So first of all, it's periodic, so it's paid regularly, so every month, and not as a one-off lump sum payment, for example. It's paid in cash, so people can decide what they need and how they use the money, rather than being vouchers or food stamps or in-kind services or anything like that. It's always paid to individuals, so not to households, to a head of a household or a family collectively. It's universal, so everyone in a given community or country or area receives it. This is why I've got universal in brackets in the title, because sometimes you do see basic income pilots that are targeted maybe to specific people or groups. But the universal qualifier is quite important, and also speaks to, I suppose, the aspiration of the UBI that we want to build, both at Equal Right and also at FASTA, so a program that is genuinely universal and extends to all. And then the final and very crucial component is that basic income is always unconditional. There is no means test, there's no requirement to work, or indeed to prove that you are looking for work. So, what does this paper actually contribute to the debate on basic income and the well-being economy more broadly? There's already a huge global literature on basic income. There's also a good deal of work that's been done in Ireland specifically, particularly work on costing and modelling basic income policies, particularly from groups like Social Justice Ireland and Basic Income Ireland. Um, and more recently, we've also had very significant pilots here generating hard impact data on what basic income can do. What hasn't really been done, at least to our knowledge in writing this paper, is trying to bring all of those different threads together. So to take the global evidence, to apply it specifically to the Irish policy context, and to put the well-being economy and ecological concerns at the center of that analysis. So three key contributions of this paper. The first is the environmental slash ecological lens that we take throughout. So we're not only asking the usual questions about can we afford basic income and how do we pay for it. That forms part of the paper. But really what we are asking is what a basic income can actually do to advance the ecological transition and climate justice. The second is that we take the international evidence from basic income and quasi basic income schemes, cash transfer programs internationally, and we map those onto the Irish policy context to see what insights they can give us. And the third is that we don't just propose basic income as a nice idea to chat about and philosophize about. We actually hope that we have set out concrete and progressive ways to pay for it that do not involve cutting public services. And that also establish policy guardrails, as we call it, to try and ensure that the basic income has that meaningful and progressive impact on society. And as far as we're aware, this is the first systemic treatment of UBI to do that in such a way. So the good news is that we're not starting from scratch on this. Ireland has already quite a substantial policy context on basic income and is actually running two live basic income programs at the moment. And both have got significant attention, particularly the basic income for artists pilot, now permanent internationally. And as part of writing this paper, I was had the pleasure of speaking to people directly who were involved with both of these programs. So the first is Basic Income for the Arts, or BIA. 2,000 artists received €325 a week over 2 years. This was a scheme that came out of the COVID response and a way to try and support artists through that. And it has just been made permanent by the new government, which is very exciting and a real statement, I think, in itself. It's also been very carefully and rigorously evaluated and produced some really interesting and impressive results. So there was a full cost-benefit analysis done by the Alma Economics Foundation, and among other insights from that paper, life satisfaction rose by nearly a full point on a 10-point scale. Reliance on job seekers' payments fell by 38 percentage points. So some really interesting social outcomes there. And I've included a quote from one of the recipients on this program who I spoke to while doing this paper, Sean and Kerr, and I thought this was quite powerful. He said about how the payments gave him the ability to go out, socialize, to get his own studio for making, creating art, and also, in his own words, to have a bit more dignity. The second Irish basic income scheme that we draw upon in this paper is the bioregional basic income, or BBI, and that is being run by Bioregioning Southeast Ireland. It is a smaller program, but it's very interesting. It deliberately leans into the ecological dimension of basic income by providing payments that are specifically place-based, so specifically on the southeast bioregion, and designed and tailored to support healthy ecosystems and thriving communities. So really leaning into that kind of environmental ecological angle. The BBI only has one recipient at the moment, but it's rolling out another and hopefully more after that very soon. The current recipient, Roger Ahern, who I also spoke to, described how a stable income really gave him the chance to change and alter his way of living, his everyday choices around consumption and his business. So he said, for example, he was happy to pay a bit more for local produce, to buy better quality things, to travel less, and not always defaulting to the cheapest option as well. So I think that says a bit about the sustainable consumption patterns that having a secure income can allow for. Now, neither of these programs is a full UBI by the BN definition. Both are targeted at particular groups, sectors, or places. But I think together they show that the mechanism can work and works in Ireland, and that Ireland is already implementing basic income in innovative ways, and maybe in ways that wouldn't immediately come to mind when you think about what a basic income is. Next slide, please. So whenever I often talk about basic income, and this was something we really wanted to include in the paper, there's two objections that come up quite a bit, especially when talking to people who might normally be sympathetic to, quote unquote, progressive policies. People who might be otherwise sympathetic, but maybe have some often valid concerns about what UBI would actually look like in practice. So the first that you hear is that UBI is a kind of Trojan horse, so that it would be used by kind of your tech bros, your Elon Musks, your Zuckerbergs, your these sort of Silicon Valley libertarian types to hand people a check. That's all they get, and then public services, welfare would be dismantled around them. And then the second concern is that basic income is often weighed up against other policies that we want. So, for example, universal basic services, that it's either or, we can't afford both, so we have to pick one. Um, each of those objections, we feel is absolutely fair, and we also believe are grounded in good faith concerns and come from the right place. Our response in this paper and how we address this is to try and frame the difference between what a regressive version of UBI is. So that would be the kind that is funded by cuts to existing welfare or public services, and also that is financed through more regressive forms of taxation. So that would be things like consumption taxes, like VAT, which are generally more regressive. Neither of those modes of structuring a basic income, so cutting public services or regressive financing levers, are what we are arguing for in this paper. We're very much setting out our stall around a progressive vision of a basic income. And that vision, that version would be funded fairly. It would be additional to strong public services, and it would be specifically designed to work alongside other progressive policy initiatives. We also feel that we shouldn't limit ourselves based on narrow visions of what can and can't be funded. So, Ireland is on track to become Europe's wealthiest country, I think, within the next 4 years. So we very much take the view in the paper that the issue is not whether the money exists, but where it is and who holds it. And that we should try and avoid, where possible, a scarcity mindset of saying we can't pay for X because we first need to fund Y, and that only plays into the kind of neoliberal scarcity mindset, heterodox economics that we have at the moment, and often causes progressive policies to be traded off against each other. Next slide, please. So now turning to the environmental case for basic income, and this is something my organization, Equal Right, works on quite a bit. So our niche is very much looking at the intersection of climate justice and basic income. And we set out kind of three key arguments for how basic income can advance a just climate transition for Ireland. And these are free ideas, and there's definitely more out there, but these are three that we tried to focus on, that we felt were relevant. So the first is that a basic income can support workers who, through no fault of their own, are being asked to make necessary sacrifices to safeguard the climate. So think, for example, of farmers in Kerry who are asked to cut their emissions on farm, or peat harvesters in the Midlands. For those people, climate action can sometimes feel like a direct threat to their income and their livelihoods. And we feel a basic income can change that. It can give them economic security, so that taking part in those necessary changes becomes something that they actually have the power and the agency to do, rather than something that is a threat to their livelihoods. Second, access to low carbon technology and investments. So Ireland has quite a few decent schemes for house retrofit and for installation of solar and other micro generation. Certainly, anyway, a lot better than what we have in the north, which is very minimal. And they usually work through partial grants and incentives. But very often, if you are on a very low income or you're renting, those incentives don't really stack up. You maybe don't have the money to invest upfront alongside the government contribution, and you're effectively locked out from taking those actions. So our thesis is that having a steady, predictable income makes it more realistic for households to save towards insulating their homes, putting up solar panels, ultimately making their homes more energy efficient and saving on energy costs. Third, resilience to climate shocks. So the flooding that we've seen recently across the island of Ireland, places like across the Midlands, in Shannon, over the last couple of winters has only got worse and worse, and is really an early warning sign of what's to come. Having a reliable income floor, especially when it is combined with cash that could be paid out ahead of predictable shocks as anticipatory action, can help households to prepare, recover, and ultimately build climate resilience instead of being tipped into crisis as a result of climate shocks and climate breakdown. Next slide, please. There are also some behavioral considerations that we've mapped out in the paper, and although these are largely unproven at scale in this context, they provide valuable theory, I feel, to think about how people might react to receiving a basic income. So the first works through time, how we use and interpret our time. If you have an unconditional income floor, you can afford to maybe work fewer paid hours without falling into poverty. And there's solid research showing that shorter working hours tends to correlate with lower carbon footprints per person. The second is about distribution and incentives. So, carbon emissions are generally heavily concentrated amongst the wealthiest in society. So, if you were to fund a basic income progressively through something like charges on heavy fossil fuel use or other forms of consumption tax related to fossil fuels, you really try and shift the spending power towards lower carbon households who are getting back the basic income, and you create positive incentives for those who are polluting and using more to try and reduce that, because they would be obviously paying less in consumption tax. And that's one place where consumption tax we feel can be progressive versus something like a VAT or a sales tax. And the third channel is psychological, which is hard to measure, but I think important. So, drawing on research into stress and addiction, and including an article that Caroline actually wrote a few years back, the argument here is that the anxious, precarious conditions of the insecure economy that we inhabit actually drive compulsive consumption and kind of cause buying as a form of stress relief. And that if we give people genuine security, you remove one of those underlying drivers of overconsumption. I would stress that these are mechanisms and ideas. They're not guarantees. That's exactly why the evidence on what happens when you give people unconditional cash really matters, and that's what we're going to turn to next. So next slide, please. So, what does the empirical evidence actually show across basic income type schemes globally? There are some really interesting insights, and this is work that we're constantly looking at and developing as part of the global Cash for Conservation network we at Equal Right are part of. So first off, we looked at Finland, so similar-ish socioeconomic context to Ireland. Some of you may remember the basic income pilot they had there back around 2018-19. And part of the research for that modeled consumption amongst basic income recipients and suggested that those recipients had a lower carbon footprint, actually amounting to around half of the control, or sorry, half of the national average, not the control group. And extrapolating from there what further scaling and rollout of basic income might do in terms of carbon footprint per capita. And in Brazil, the Bolsa Verde program, which was a very light conditional cash transfer program, almost like an unconditional cash transfer, um, which paid cash to families in conservation areas, was associated with deforestation of up to 53% lower in the intervention areas compared with control areas. There's also some strong qualitative examples that we looked at as well. So, for example, in Namibia, there was a basic income grant, I think around 10 years ago, which took away a lot of the economic pressures that people that had been pushing people to go into poaching to feed their families. Also in Peru, a more recent and very innovative program on a conservation basic income with indigenous communities in the Peruvian Amazon, led by an amazing NGO called Cool Earth, has shown that as a result of unconditional cash interventions, communities are more able to hold on to their land tenure against pressures from encroaching loggers, and also are able to spend more of their time on community-based conservation activities. So the key takeaway from this literature was really that environmental outcomes are often dependent and contingent on program design and local context, but that cash can produce environmental benefits when it removes the specific economic pressures that are driving ecological harm in the first place. Next slide, please. So in the paper, we're not trying to make the case that basic income is a silver bullet, that it fixes everything on its own. The way we picture it is really this diagram that we developed in the paper, and that's visualizing basic income as the foundation or the income floor, sitting underneath a whole suite of complementary measures designed to enhance sufficiency across the economy. So this diagram is taken directly from the paper, and we've mapped out various different measures that sit on top of the basic income foundation. So on that you have place-based and ecological measures, so things like home retrofit that I already mentioned, stronger local food systems, community wealth building, community energy schemes. You have public services and a living wage. That you have initiatives around work and time, so that could include things like a green job guarantee program, or a shorter working week, or a 4-day work week as well. So these are all policies that we like, and we're not saying it's basic income or these. We're saying basic income is the foundation that we build these policies on top of. And also, we recognize, and going back to those concerns around a sort of regressive techno bro basic income, that basic income needs its own guardrails so that it doesn't have any perverse effects. So things like protections for public service spending, hard caps on resource extraction, so overconsumption is mitigated, and also a shift towards more commons-based taxation. And the reason that the basic income floor matters so much is that without it, we feel that a lot of these other measures actually stay out of reach for many households who need them most, and that having that income security first is really vital as a starting point or a catalyst to make those other policies not just possible, but also mutually reinforcing. Next slide, please. So, how do we pay for it? And this is very often the first question we get asked as basic income advocates. It is in the paper. I'm not going to dwell on it too much in terms of mapping out a full costing. And actually, there has been a lot of work done, as I mentioned, by different organisations, Social Justice Ireland, Basic Income Ireland, amongst others. But we looked at there's kind of two figures that are commonly cropping up in terms of what level of basic income would be paid at, and those are €203 a week, which would lift most households in poverty above the poverty line. And also the basic income for artists rate, which is €325 a week, which would bring people over the minimum essential standard of living measure for a single adult. In terms of how we fund that, there's a menu of progressive commons-based levers that we look at within the paper. The main scaffolding for this, doing most of the heavy lifting around raising the money, would be reform of the income tax and social insurance systems in Ireland. So models for those have been developed in detail by members of Social Justice Ireland and Basic Income Ireland. They're referenced there, and would say definitely go away and delve into the detail on those. But those are broadly revenue neutral for most earners. So generally those at the bottom of the income pyramid and in the middle are benefiting from that system, and higher earners are paying slightly more. Beyond that, though, we thought about how you could have a site value tax on land, which even at a modest rate could raise around €1 billion a year. And I know that's a policy Caroline has done a lot of work on. A wealth tax, which has been modelled by different people for Ireland, but some of the estimates sit around 1 to 2.5 billion per year that could be raised with that. And also cap and share, which is a policy that both Equal Right and FASTA do a lot of work on, which puts a cap on fossil fuel extraction, levies a carbon charge or tax on that extraction, and then redistributes the revenues from that as basic income. I think the key takeaway that we want to say here is that basic income can be funded by taxing wealth, by putting progressive taxation on common assets that we all have a right to, rather than by cutting public services or welfare. And last slide, and I'm just going to close up with this. So to wrap up, in the conclusion, the paper makes 5 key recommendations to government, policymakers, and indeed, anyone interested in making this happen. The central one is to build a UBI out of two things that Ireland already has. So to look at the child benefit and the state pension, and really extend those out to all residents of all citizens of Ireland, and indeed residents. That's a fair point. And that could start at the job seekers allowance rate and then rise over time towards that higher rate, closer to the basic income for artists figure of 325 a week. Alongside that, it's important to flesh out and put in place the guardrails around a basic income policy, so protections for public services, complementary policies, so what we would build on top of the basic income floor, and also caps on certain types of resource extraction as well to stay within planetary boundaries. Then it's important we do more serious empirical work, so really look at the research and modelling to move Ireland's tax base towards taxing the commons and funding a basic income. Leverage opportunities like Ireland's co-hosting of the fossil fuel transitioning, sorry, the transitioning away from fossil fuel conference next year. They've changed the name of that a few times, which is why I was thrown off. It started in Colombia this March, and it's now moving to Ireland, co-hosted by Tuvalu next April time. And that would be an excellent opportunity to scope out things like cap and share policies as well, which look to tie up social protection and climate justice and a just transition together. And then finally, something the government could do, which would be quite interesting, and I have to do a plug for as someone based in the north, is look at commissioning an all-island feasibility study, possibly as part of the shared island initiative into what a basic income for the whole island of Ireland might look like. So I believe that the paper, if it's not already live on the FASTA website, is going to go live very soon. So please do go on there, read the detail. There should be contacts either on the website or on the paper where you can reach out to those of us who contributed to us with any questions or feedback, but also happy to take any of those comments now with what's left of the call. So thank you very much for listening, everyone, and I will hand back to Caroline, and then I think Sarath as well is going to come in.
Thanks so much, Patrick. That was great. I'm delighted to welcome Sarath Davala now. He's the president of the Basic Income Earth Network, or BIAN, and he'll be saying a few words about BIAN and giving us a few reflections on the paper. And he's joining us from Hyderabad, India. So thank you very much, Sarath, and it's over to you. Right.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone, and it's good evening for me. It's really a pleasure to be here, and this is such an important event here, and it's so nice to see familiar faces here, comrades here, and it's always a pleasure to meet UBI community and those who support universal basic income. And I'm actually not a fan of reading out the text, but it is such an exciting topic, and in order to discipline myself, I just put out something, and then which I will read out. Okay. Just let me say a few words about BN first. The Basic Income Earth Network was founded in 1986. It's the world's largest and the oldest network dedicated to study and advancement of universal basic income. Over the past 4 decades, it has brought together researchers, policymakers, activists, trade unionists, practitioners, and civil society organizations from across the world to explore one simple but profound idea. Every person has a right to economic security simply by virtue of being a human being and a member of society. Today, BN is present in more than 60 countries and has had the privilege of witnessing the basic income conversation move from the margins to the mainstream. We have seen pilots emerge from across the world, and I've been myself involved in 2 pilots in India. And governments now begin to experiment with unconditional cash transfers. And as you all know, governments do their own thing, and usually it kind of departs from our definition, which Patrick has really beautifully put there. So there is an increasing recognition that economic security is foundational to freedom, dignity, and democracy. It's therefore particularly gratifying to join the launch of this important Irish contribution to the global conversation. Having read the paper with great interest, I would first like to congratulate the authors and partner organizations. What struck me immediately is that this paper asks a larger question than many papers on basic income. It asks not merely, should we have a basic income? Should we have a universal basic income? Rather, it asks, what kind of economy are we trying to build? That, I believe, is exactly the right question. The paper argues persuasively that the challenges of our time, climate change, inequality, precarity, and ecological overshoot cannot be adequately addressed by an economic model that continues to place GDP growth at its center. Instead, it invites us to imagine a well-being economy organized around human flourishing within planetary boundaries. I was particularly pleased to see that the paper adopts BN's long-standing definition of basic income as a periodic cash transfer given to all individuals. These are the 5 characteristics continue to provide an important anchor for our movement all over the world. Another significant contribution of the paper is its distinction between progressive and regressive versions of universal basic income. Those of us who have been in the movement for many years know that there is no such thing as a basic income or the basic income. There are many proposals that travel under that name. This paper is comfortably clear, commendably clear on in advocating a progressive version, one financed through commons-based and redistributive mechanisms designed to complement rather than replace public services. I was also encouraged by the discussion of Ireland's own policy innovations, the basic income for the arts, and the bioregional basic income. These remind us that ideas become real when communities and governments are willing to experiment. Ireland has every reason to be proud of its contribution to the global basic income conversation. As the chair of Basic BN, I would add one broader reflection. Basic income is ultimately about freedom, the freedom to refuse exploitation and the freedom to say no. The freedom to care, the freedom for children, care for children, elders, communities, and the natural world. And increasingly, the freedom to participate in the great ecological transition of our time without leaving millions of people behind. This paper reminds us that a just transition must also be a secure transition. Finally, I want to commend the authors for resisting the temptation to present UBI as a silver bullet. The future will not be built by one policy alone. It will be built through a new social contract, one that combines economic security, ecological responsibility, and human dignity. This paper is a valuable contribution to that conversation. Finally, let me say that this paper deserves an audience beyond Ireland. I will be sharing it with my colleagues within BN, and I hope we can feature it through our communication channels in the coming months. I would also welcome one of BN's volunteers preparing a short review of or reflection for our membership and website, because I believe this paper contributes something important to the international discussion, namely the relationship between universal basic income, well-being economies, and ecological transition. Congratulations once again to everyone involved, and thank you for moving the conversation from principle towards practice. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for that thoughtful reflection, Sarath. And we're looking forward to seeing the BN review of the paper in due course. That's great to know about. So now it's time to open up to the floor. So if anyone has questions or comments, Patrick and I will be glad to respond to them. So please go ahead and put up your hands or put your questions and comments in the chat. Thank you.
No, Paul, yeah, Paul. Both Pauls. Paul Leach was marginally ahead of Paul Harnett. So, Paul, if you'd like to unmute and go ahead. And anyone else called Paul is also welcome.
Sure. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me?
Yes, just about.
Yeah. I just want to make this point that in a previous presentation discussion with Pascal Donoghue, hitherto our Minister for Finance and Expenditure variously, and now moved to the World Bank. The key point is that he was remarkably open to the idea space of FASTA. And he invited FASTA to join the annual national conversation on our economy. And it seems to me that this paper provides a marvelous vehicle, a marvelous agenda item. And he is still, although he's not my favorite politician, but at least he thinks. He's constantly reviewing economic theory, as in last weekend's paper. So that's my question and point. Is that relevant? And could that provide a kind of fulcrum or leverage into the institutional idea space?
Yeah, great contribution, Paul. I mean, I don't lead advocacy within FASTA, so I'll maybe hand over to anyone from FASTA on that, but I certainly would be happy to play a part in any of that work.
Yeah, I'll briefly come in on that and then I'll let the other Paul speak. Yes, so we have followed up on that, Paul, and yeah, I agree. That's a really good lead to follow on. As I'm sure you know, Pascal Donoghue isn't in the Irish administration anymore. He's now gone to the World Bank, so totally different, voltage, as it were. But and obviously there are areas where we would disagree quite strongly as well. But I do think it's great that he did seem open to quite a bit of what we were saying at that conference, and we have indeed participated in the National Economic Dialogue since then twice. And I agree. I think there is a lot that can be worked on. It's a lot of it's about establishing common goals and working towards those. I don't know if anyone else would like to weigh in, because I know there were folks here who were at that dialogue. But for the moment, I'll pass to the other Paul. What was your question, Paul?
Yeah, I was wondering to what extent the EU might constrain membership of the EU, Ireland's membership, might constrain any implementation of UBI, in particular with respect to the revenue raising options that have been presented. I don't know if you've looked at that or not, Patrick, but certainly that was... Certain tax issues were raised before Brexit, saying, oh, it'll give us the freedom to do A, B, C, D, and E, which we all know was rubbish. But anyway, that's the question. Is membership of the EU a constraining factor, do you think?
Well, it's not something that I've looked at or modeled in detail, Paul, but I would say where there is a will, there's a way. And in response, I would point to Ireland's corporation tax as an example of where Ireland has been able to maybe get a slightly special deal in terms of fiscal policy. And there may be other ways to package something similar to the EU for a basic income.
Yeah, I could just add to that taxation is a member state competence, so if we're using taxation for the basis of a basic income, then in theory, there shouldn't be a trouble. I wouldn't think there shouldn't be a problem with that. Anne Ryan has just posted in the chat that Ireland could make a great demonstration case for UBI within the EU, which I think is true. Let me see. Did you have another question, Paul? Because your hand's still up there.
No, I'll lower it now. There you go.
So yeah, there's some. While we're waiting to see if anyone has comments or questions, I'll just look back at what's in the chat as well. At what age is it paid? I mean, I'd assume it would be 18, right, Patrick? The basic income. One thing I think maybe we should reiterate is just that the costings. I mean, what we're recommending to begin with in our recommendations in the paper is that we use a funding model that was actually developed by Basic Income Ireland members. Now, there's some other very good funding models as well. Social Justice Ireland has also come out with some interesting ideas for that, and definitely worth considering different ideas. But what we like about the Basic Income Ireland one is that it's in a way it's quite cautious, you could say. It's not asking people to pay massively more taxes, particularly people who aren't earning very much. It's very carefully thought through, and it's very compatible with the Irish tax system. And there's a question in there about FDI income, which is a good point, and it's not secure, and and that we mustn't be too reliant on, for example, corporate tax and so on. And so obviously, everything's moving all the time. We all know we're in a very unstable situation in terms of Ireland's income. I suppose our thinking is that it's good to put some things in place now, and then to have a kind of a system for rolling in more stable sources of income, like site value tax or other commons-based types of income over time. And that's in our recommendations. That's one of the things that we suggest. The sums that were done by Basic Income Ireland, and they've done a really good job. I think they've been very careful in what they've done, and their paper is linked to in our paper. There's still no hands, so I'll carry on for a minute. I also just wanted to mention another thing that comes up sometimes, which is the fact that there was a few years ago in Ireland, there was the Commission for Taxation and Welfare, which came out with some very interesting ideas, but what came out quite strongly against UBI. And we would really counter, or we would really push back on some of the things that are assumed in that paper. And just very briefly, the studies that it focuses on aren't just in line with what I've just been saying. They aren't at all relating to Ireland. It does point to a couple of Irish studies, but they're very old, from the 90s, the early 80s. They aren't looking at recent studies, and there are issues with the studies in themselves as well. So anyway, that's another discussion, but I just wanted to flag that because sometimes that comes up. So I'm not sure. We've got Sean and Breed. Maybe Breed, go first if you don't mind, and then Sean.
Thanks very much, Caroline, and thanks to Paul for an interesting presentation, and I'm looking forward to having a look at the paper. I was just curious about the answer to the age question if you're talking about looking at combining child benefit and state contributory pension, because child benefit is paid for young people up to the age of 16 or up to 19 if they remain in education. So if the aim is that you're looking at a UBI from 18 onwards, how would that work in terms of then supporting parents with children? Because that, I suppose, it's seen as a support for children payment. So just your thoughts on that. You may well have answered it in the paper, but it's just one of the things that's just struck me as looking at some of the answers in the chat. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think I was answering that more sort of broadly in terms of basic income policies that they tend to start around 16 or 18. So I should have been more specific to say that in the paper, we're very much looking at something that is universal for every individual, including children, and that's where the reform of child credit and pension comes into the conversation as well.
Great, thanks, Frida. Sean, you want to come in?
Great, thanks very much. I put in a couple of questions in the chat, but I suppose the nub of what I want to ask is it's a fabulous paper, and there are obviously some peripheral questions around it. But how do we see an implementation of it, or where do you start to make it happen, or are there steps? I mean, because we could go on discussing for years and years, and it would be really nice. There's this metaphor that I used to use years ago about throwing an anchor forward and pulling yourself to the anchor by the rope. So, is there any timeline? Which groups do we want to start with? I mean, you could start with carers, or you could start with the whole horticultural industry, or farmers, or anywhere. And some groups will be easier than others, I think, but there's going to be a lot of opposition there as well. So how do you address implementation, and have you done it already?
Do I take that, or do you want to?
I could say a little bit about that
Please,
because we've thought a lot about that in Basic Income Ireland. For people who are in work, in receipt of income from employment, it would be kind of done through revenue, and everyone basically would have a payment made into their bank account. Or everybody who's entitled, everyone who has habitual residency and who would be regularly entitled to some payments from the state would basically have a post office or bank account, and it would be an automatic payment. So, and the way that the Basic Income Ireland model has shown it for Ireland, it could be rolled out very quickly because it's actually replacing a lot of the core social welfare payments while the top-ups remain for people with additional needs. So it really wouldn't be very difficult. And on the other point, Sean, I think it's universal is universal, and doing it with different sectors is not getting us where we need to go, because you'll always have discussions about who needs it more than others, and carers are more deserving. And so then you get into this discussion of the deserving and the undeserving. So I don't want to labour that too much, but it is very doable, and I would recommend looking at that link to the Basic Income Ireland paper by John Baker and Dave Quinn that's in the FASTA paper as well.
Yeah, sorry, Anne, if I could just come back. I think that's a really, really important point, that what we're saying is that we don't want to go down the road of sector or groups or anything. It's all or nothing. And I think that would clarify things an awful lot in any discussion that's going on. And I'm not sure, obviously I haven't read the paper yet, I'm looking forward to it, but maybe that needs to be made very clear, because I think the tendency will be to say, oh, artists got it, who's going to get it next? And I think what you're saying is, no, this is universal, we're going for universal. And then my question would be, well, when? How do we see this happening? And I think we need to be bold about it. I think there's never been a better time to be putting it. Like, there's so much uncertainty around, and for once this gives an awful lot of people great certainty.
Yeah, I think I would just add to that as well in terms of how I was framing the different pilots in Ireland, different programs in the paper. like, let's learn from what they've done. Let's learn about the positive impacts that they've had, but let's look at that in a way that, wouldn't it be great if this applied to everybody on a universal basis? So let's really value those programs, but let's not limit ourselves to a step-by-step sectoral approach, because as Anne says, it does get very, very complicated in terms of how you build up from there to a universal program.
Great, thank you. Could I suggest we take one final question and then we can maybe leave off? So Lewis, I see you got your hand up there.
Thank you. Yeah, so I didn't read the paper in advance, so sorry if you have already answered this. I like the idea of UBI. I like what drives the desire for an UBI, but I see UBI as a wealth transfer mechanism, rent in the general sense of rent. I mean, I'm sure you guys have already thought about this. How are you addressing it? And apologies if you want me to clarify the question further. I'm just trying to go for a little time here.
So, just to understand this more, is this basically a concern around how capital would reap the benefits from people having a basic income, or?
Pretty much, yeah. You already addressed a little bit of this in the objections in the slide, but not fully. Specifically, like I'll give you like the obvious example to me was the Help to Buy scheme, 25K for new builds, average price bump of 24K. Coincidence, right? No. The same thing like UBI, if I imagine that I use it to satisfy my rent, guess what happens, right? So that's the feeling I get here, is that this becomes a funnel from the revenue to asset owners, and they are more than welcome to, like, they are very eager to find more of these funnels, right?
Yeah, and look, there's a broader conversation around inflation and the inflationary impact that a basic income may or may not have, and a lot of that has to do with the productive capacity of the economy that you're doing basic income within. Ireland has a very dynamic economy, so is likely to be able to absorb quite a lot of additional spending. But also the way that we've framed it in the paper is more of a redistributive approach, where we are looking at redistributing existing money within the system rather than creating new money within the system. So it's the same amount of money, it's just being distributed and flowing in different places through wealth-based taxation, income taxation, commons-based taxation. So in that regard, I feel the inflationary risk of the model is probably lessened. But also that's where the concern around guardrails is really important, and making sure that there are adequate public services and protections of the spending towards those public services in parallel with any basic income, so that you do have things like affordable housing and rent controls as safeguards to ensure that that scenario you've mentioned doesn't happen as a result of the basic income.
Yeah, exactly. Healthcare is going to be the immediate obvious example as well, right? We already have a two-tier process in Ireland. So, sorry, I took too much time. I'll step back.
No, not at all. I'll just say a final thing myself in response there, because just to add to what Patrick said, part of why we put so much emphasis on commons-based taxation, and particularly the site value tax, for example, is exactly that. It's to stop that kind of rentier behavior. It's discussed somewhat more in the paper, and then there are links to more resources, but we'd see that as really vital. Yeah, because otherwise you do have this risk, as you say, of it being, there being undesirable outcomes. So we have to be really careful with that. So yeah, so great. Thank you very much. And thanks everybody. It's been a fantastic discussion. Anne-Marie, are you still there? I don't know if you're still there. Do you want to say a quick word?
Well, very quickly, I just have my camera off because I'm low internet bandwidth, but I just wanted to say thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon for the launch of the paper. There was a really fascinating discussion, and as you can see, there's some really useful information in that paper for us all to advocate for policy change in Ireland on this. And I don't know if Caroline, if you have a chance, but if she will hopefully put in some links some of them are to sign up for the Galore, if you want information on the Galore Degrowth Conference and Festival that is going to be happening in Cork next August 2027. We also have, if you want to sign up for the mailing list for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance Ireland Hub and for FASTA. And of course, if you want to follow up on any of the conversations that we had today, or have any other questions, please do get in touch with us. We'd love to continue this conversation with you all. And I wish you all a lovely afternoon and weekend. And take care, and thank you all so much for joining us.
Thanks, Emery. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much, folks. See you. Bye.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye, everyone.